I'm Natalie Corrigan, 31 years old, a nurse practitioner working out of Nashville, Tennessee. For 5 years, I sent my parents $1,800 every single month. Not because they were sick, not because they were elderly. My father was 54 and my mother was 52. They were both perfectly capable of working, but somewhere along the way they decided that my paycheck was their retirement plan, and I was too afraid of losing them to say no. The night my daughter was born, I called my mother from the delivery room. My husband Derek was holding my hand, and I was still shaking from the epidural wearing off. I just wanted to hear her voice. I wanted my mom. She picked up on the second ring, and before I could even get the words out, she said, "Natalie, this isn't a good time. Your brother needs us right now." Then she hung up. I stared at the ceiling of that hospital room for a long time. Derek didn't say anything. He just watched my face. And something that had been quietly cracking inside me for 5 years finally broke completely open. I picked up my phone and started making calls. By the time my daughter took her first breath, I had canceled every automatic transfer, closed the shared credit card, and sent an email to my bank flagging my parents' access to anything connected to my accounts. It took less than 40 minutes to undo 5 years of silence. 20 minutes after that, my father's name lit up my screen 17 times in a row. I didn't answer. My parents live in Clarksville, about an hour from Nashville. My father worked in logistics for most of my childhood, but he took an early retirement package when I was in my mid-20s and never went back. My mother had been a dental hygienist, but she stopped working around the same time, citing stress and back problems that somehow never required a doctor's visit or a diagnosis. By the time I graduated from my nurse practitioner program and started my first real job, they had quietly positioned themselves as people who simply could not manage without help. It started small. A few $100s for their electric bill one month, a car repair the next. My mother would call in this particular tone she had, soft and tired, like she was already apologizing for existing, and I would feel something in my chest collapse and reach for my debit card. My younger brother Tyler, 27, and chronically between jobs, lived with them off and on. I told myself I was helping my whole family stay afloat. I told myself it was temporary. Then temporary became $1,800 a month, wired on the first like clockwork. Their mortgage in Clarksville was $980. I covered it. My mother's car note was $340. I covered that too. There were grocery runs and utility bills and random expenses they'd mention almost as afterthoughts. Oh, by the way, the water heater needs replacing. Dad's prescription changed and the new one isn't covered. I'd sit at my kitchen table after a 10-hour shift and just transfer money without even really thinking about it anymore. It had become automatic, like paying rent, except I was paying for their life and still trying to scrape together enough for my own. Derek noticed before I was ready to admit it. He never pushed. He would just get quiet when I got off the phone with my parents. That specific kind of quiet that meant he had something to say but was choosing not to. One night after I told him I needed to pull from our savings to cover my parents' HVAC repair, he set down his fork and looked at me. "Nat, when does this end?" I didn't have an answer. I told him I didn't know. He nodded slowly and went back to his food and didn't bring it up again for months. But I knew he was counting. I knew he was watching the number in our savings account stay flat, while my parents' life stayed comfortable and mine kept getting squeezed. My brother Tyler was a different conversation entirely. He had this effortless charm that made my parents light up in a way they never did with me. My mother would talk about him to her friends like he was still full of potential, like he was just between opportunities, like his situation was temporary in a way mine never was. I was the stable one. I was the one with the steady job and the salary, and so I was treated like a resource rather than a daughter. Tyler would show up at their house for weeks at a time, eat their food, watch their TV, borrow their car, and my parents would beam. They were never stressed when Tyler was around. They were only stressed when they needed something I hadn't provided yet. I remember calling my mother once after a particularly brutal shift. I'd had a patient coding and another family in crisis, and I was sitting in my car in the hospital parking lot at 10 at night, just needing to hear a familiar voice. She spent most of the call telling me about a problem Tyler was having with his landlord. When I tried to redirect, to say I just needed to talk for a minute, she said, "Natalie, you always land on your feet. Tyler struggles more than you do." I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. Stable. That was the word they used for me. Not loved. Not appreciated. Stable, like I was a piece of infrastructure. My best friend Carla had been watching all of this for years. She's a social worker in Nashville, and she has the particular skill of saying true things without softening them so much they stop being true. She told me over coffee one afternoon, "They have trained you to believe that needing them is a character flaw and needing you is their right." I laughed it off. I changed the subject. But her words sat in the back of my mind for the rest of that year like a splinter I couldn't reach. Derek and I found out we were pregnant in the spring. We were terrified and thrilled in equal measure. I had been quietly building a small savings account on the side for about 2 years. Nothing my parents knew about. Just $300 a month into a separate account at a different bank that I never talked about. It was $7,200. I looked at that number when I found out we were pregnant and felt something protective rise up in me. That money was for my daughter, not for anyone else. I told my parents about the pregnancy at dinner at their house. My mother smiled and said, "Oh, how wonderful." Then she asked if we had thought about whether I'd take a full maternity leave or try to go back early because their property taxes were due in February and things were tight. I kept my face very still. I said we'd figure it out. Derek's jaw was set the entire drive home. The pregnancy was harder than I expected physically. I was on my feet all day at the clinic, and by my 3rd trimester, I was exhausted in a way that felt cellular. My parents called a few times, usually to tell me about something they needed. My mother had a tooth that needed a crown. My father's car inspection was overdue, and the deductible on their auto policy had gone up. I transferred the money. I always transferred the money. The one time I asked my mother if she could come stay with us for a week before my due date, just to help get the nursery organized. She said she would try, but Tyler needed her to drive him to some appointments that week, and it was complicated. She never came. My due date was November 14th. My daughter, Ren, arrived 11 days early in the middle of the night, while a cold rain came down outside the hospital windows. She was small and pink and furious, and I was completely overwhelmed with love in a way that rearranged something fundamental in me. The first person I wanted to tell was my mother. That is the thing about family wounds. Even when you're standing in the evidence of how little you matter to them, your first instinct is still to reach for them. She picked up and said it wasn't a good time. Tyler needed them. She hung up. I lay there in that hospital bed with my daughter on my chest, and I felt something go completely cold inside me. Not grief. Not even anger. Not yet. Just a final, absolute clarity. I thought about 5 years of transfers. 5 years of skipped vacations and flat savings accounts and late nights at the kitchen table doing math that never quite worked out. 5 years of being the stable one. And they couldn't pick up the phone on the night I had a baby. I handed Ren to Derek and asked him to give me 10 minutes. I opened my banking app and canceled the auto pay. I called the credit card company and had my parents removed as authorized users. I sent an email to my bank's fraud department, flagging an upcoming scenario in which someone might try to initiate a transfer using my old account information. I documented everything in a folder I labeled simply with the date. Then I picked my daughter back up and held her and didn't think about my parents again until morning. My father called 17 times. My mother sent a text at 2 in the morning that just said, "What did you do?" In the morning, when I was ready, I sent them a single message. I told them I had welcomed my daughter into the world. I told them the financial support was ending. I told them I wished them well. I did not explain myself beyond that. I had spent 31 years explaining myself to people who weren't listening. My father called Carla. I don't know how he got her number. He told her I was having some kind of breakdown and she needed to talk sense into me. Carla called me immediately and told me exactly what he'd said, then added, "I told him he seemed very clear-headed to me." I loved her for that. 2 days after I got home from the hospital, a letter arrived. Handwritten on paper from a notepad I recognized from their kitchen. My mother's handwriting, slanted and tight. It said I was throwing away my family over money. It said I had always been selfish, even as a child. It said that when they were older and sick and needed real help, I would regret this. It said Tyler deserved support too, and I had never once considered that. I read it twice. Then, I took a photo of it and sent it to Carla and to Derek's mother, Linda, who had driven 4 hours from Knoxville to be with us for Ren's first week home. Linda read the letter and set it down on the kitchen table very carefully. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Honey, that letter tells me everything about why you turned out so well despite them." She poured us both coffee, and we didn't talk about my parents for the rest of the day. About a week after I got home, Derek's uncle Raymond, who had handled my in-laws' estate after Derek's grandfather passed, called Derek with something unexpected. He had been cleaning out a storage unit and found documents from my maternal grandparents' estate. My grandparents on my mother's side had both passed when I was in college, within a year of each other. I had been close to them, particularly my grandmother Ruth, who had been the kind of steady, practical woman my mother never was. Raymond had found correspondence indicating that my grandparents had established a small trust, $60,000 split equally between my mother and her sister Deborah, to be distributed on the condition that it not be used for gambling, the purchase of vehicles, or loans to family members. The trust had been administered by an attorney in Murfreesboro. Raymond thought we might want to look into it. I called Carla. She made some calls of her own. Within 3 days, we had the name of the attorney, a man who had retired but whose former firm still had the records. The news that came back stopped me cold. The trust had originally been split into 2 portions, one for my mother and one for Aunt Deborah. My mother's share had been drawn down over 8 years in a series of withdrawals that violated the conditions of the trust. The final withdrawal, for $12,000, had been made using paperwork that included a forged co-signature. Aunt Deborah's signature. Deborah, who lived in Memphis and whom I called immediately, had no idea any of this had happened. She thought her portion of the trust was still intact and had been planning to use it to help with her own retirement. She hadn't been in regular contact with my mother in years. My grandmother had meant for that money to give her daughters security. My mother had quietly emptied her own share and forged her sister's name to get more of it, while calling me every month to cover her mortgage. I sat with that information for a long time. The month after Ren was born, Tyler showed up at my house unannounced. He parked in my driveway on a Tuesday afternoon and knocked like it was completely normal. I answered the door still holding Ren, who was 3 weeks old and had decided she was nocturnal. Tyler looked at the baby briefly, said she was cute, and then said he needed to talk to me about the money situation because it was really affecting the family. I asked him how much my parents had been paying his rent. He didn't answer right away, which was an answer. I asked if he knew they had been using money I sent them to cover his expenses. He said that wasn't exactly how he'd characterize it. I told him he was welcome to characterize it however he liked on the way back to his car. I closed the door. He texted me that night that I was acting crazy and that postpartum could do that to people and maybe I should talk to someone. I screenshotted it and added it to the folder. 2 days after Tyler's visit, I got a voicemail from an unknown number. It was my mother. She'd called from a number I didn't recognize, probably a friend's phone, knowing I wouldn't pick up otherwise. Her voice on the message was different from the letter. Quieter. She said she was sorry for how she'd handled the night Ren was born. She said she'd been under a lot of stress and hadn't been herself. She said she wanted to meet her granddaughter. She said if I would just talk to her we could work things out. I listened to it 3 times. I recognized that voice. It was the same soft, tired voice she'd used when she called about the electric bill. The same voice that made something in my chest collapse and reach for my debit card. I knew it wasn't an apology. It was a strategy. I didn't call back. Carla and I met with the attorney Deborah had hired to investigate the trust irregularities. The picture that emerged was not simple. My mother had been making withdrawals for over 8 years, always in amounts just small enough to avoid triggering automatic review. The forged signature had been added to the final large withdrawal, the one that had been flagged only because Deborah had separately requested a trust status report. The attorney believed there was enough evidence to pursue civil and potentially criminal fraud charges. Deborah decided to move forward. I provided the letter my mother had sent me, as well as the documentation I had of my mother's pattern of requesting money while sitting on trust funds she had no legal right to fully access. I did not feel good about it. I want to be honest about that. There is no version of turning legal documents over to an attorney to be used against your mother that feels triumphant. I sat in that office and felt tired in a way that had nothing to do with the newborn at home. I thought about my grandmother Ruth, her neat handwriting, the way she smelled like lavender and always had hard candy in her coat pocket. I thought about what she would make of all of this. I don't think she would be surprised exactly. But I think she would be surprised exactly. My parents were formally notified of the civil claim 3 weeks later. My father called Derek's cell phone, which was a miscalculation on his part because Derek handed me the phone already recording. My father's voice was not the flat, tired voice of the man who had spent years letting my mother do the calling. He was loud and specific. He said I had always had a problem with authority. He said I was destroying the family because I was jealous of Tyler. He said I would come crawling back when things got hard with the baby and I had no support system. He said some other things I won't repeat here because Ren was asleep in the next room and certain words don't belong in the same house as a sleeping infant. I let him finish. Then I said, "I'm going to need you to not call this number again." Derek ended the call. We filed for a no-contact order the following morning, citing the recorded call, my father's previous attempts to contact third parties, and the threatening letter from my mother. The order was granted. Linda came back up from Knoxville that weekend with her sister and 2 casseroles, and we had a very quiet, very warm dinner around our kitchen table. Ren slept through most of it in her bassinet by the window. Derek gave a little toast, nothing formal, just raised his glass of sparkling water and said he was grateful for the people in the room. I looked around at Linda and her sister and Carla and Derek and felt something I hadn't expected to feel in the middle of all of it. I felt held. Deborah and I started talking more after everything came out. We'd never been close because my mother had quietly kept us at a distance from each other in the way that people who have things to hide tend to do. Deborah is 63 and sharp and has a wry sense of humor that catches me off guard. She told me that she had suspected for years that something was off with my mother's relationship to money, but had never had documentation. She said she felt guilty for not looking into it sooner. I told her there was nothing to feel guilty about. People believe what they want to believe about family until they can't anymore. The civil case was settled out of court. I won't go into every detail, but the settlement required my mother to repay a portion of the fraudulent withdrawals from the trust on a structured timeline. It wasn't everything Deborah was owed, but it was something. My mother and father were also required to liquidate certain assets. As of the date the settlement was finalized, they were renting a smaller apartment in a part of Clarksville that cost significantly less than the house I had been paying for. I did not feel satisfaction about that either. I felt something more like the absence of dread, a specific weight gone from a specific part of my chest. Tyler sent me one more message, about 2 months after everything settled. He said he hoped I was happy with what I'd done to the family. He said Mom was really struggling. He said he didn't know how I slept at night. I typed and deleted several responses. Eventually, I sent nothing. I have not heard from him since, and I have not reached out. What I think about now, in the quiet moments when Ren is asleep and the house is still, is my grandmother Ruth. I think about the fact that she set money aside because she wanted to give her daughters something. She wanted them to feel secure. She had no way of knowing her daughter would spend that security down and then come looking for more from her own child. I think about how I am now putting money away every month in an account with Ren's name on it. A real college fund this time at a bank my parents have no knowledge of and no access to. I think about how when Ren is old enough to understand any of this, what I want her to know is not the story of what they did. I want her to know what I did after. I set a boundary. I held it. I found my people, the ones who showed up, the ones who made casseroles and drove 4 hours and recorded phone calls and sat across from attorneys and said, "This is what we have, let's build the case." I found my family. It just didn't end up being the family I was born into. Derek and I are renovating the back bedroom this spring. We're going to make it a proper guest room so Linda can visit more easily. We picked out a soft green paint for the walls. Ren likes to sit in the sun that comes through that window in the late afternoon and watch the light move. She is the most unhurried creature I have ever met, and I think she is teaching me something. Setting a limit on what I would give was not abandoning my family. It was the first time in my adult life I had decided that I was also worth protecting. That my daughter was worth protecting. That the people who show up, who hold your hand, who drive through the night when you need them, Those are the people you build your life around. The others, you let go. And then you keep going. And slowly, steadily, you begin to understand that letting go was not the end of something. It was the beginning. I think about cause and effect a lot now, not in any grand or abstract way. Just in the quiet, practical sense of every choice has a weight, and eventually that weight lands somewhere. My parents made choices for years, small ones at first. Let Natalie cover this bill. Let Natalie handle that expense. Don't thank her too much, or she might think it's optional. Keep Tyler comfortable. Keep the apartment. Keep the life. And somewhere in that long string of small choices, they seemed to have decided that my presence in their lives was guaranteed no matter what they did, that my love was a fixed resource they could draw from indefinitely without ever putting anything back. What they didn't account for was that I was also making choices. Every month I transferred that money, I was choosing them over myself. Every time I picked up the phone after a hard shift hoping for a moment of connection and got a bill instead, I filed that away somewhere. I didn't process it consciously, but it accumulated. And the night I called from a hospital room with my daughter on my chest and my mother said it wasn't a good time, something in me that had been quietly accumulating for 31 years simply reached its limit. That's not drama. That's not revenge. That's just math. What I've come to understand, slowly and without any neat conclusion, is that integrity is not a feeling. It's a practice. It's what you do when the feeling is complicated and the right thing is still clear. Cutting off my parents didn't feel good. It felt like grief dressed up as relief. But I knew it was right, and I did it anyway, and I held the line even when my father called 17 times and my mother wrote that letter and Tyler showed up at my door with his particular brand of casual manipulation. Holding that line over and over, in the face of people who had spent decades training me not to, was the hardest and most honest thing I have ever done. There's something about becoming a mother that made the logic of it undeniable. I looked at Ren and I thought, I will not model this for her. I will not let her watch me shrink and apologize and transfer money to people who treat my existence as a service. I will show her what it looks like to know your own value. Not perfectly, not without doubt, but consistently enough that she grows up understanding that love is not a transaction and family is not a debt you owe by birth. Carla told me once that the people who drain you rarely know they're doing it. That doesn't make it acceptable. It just means you can let go without needing them to admit what they did. I didn't get an apology. I got a letter full of accusations and a voicemail that was really just another ask dressed in softer clothes. I let it be what it was. I didn't need them to confess to move forward. Derek, Linda, Carla. These are the people who showed up. Not when it was easy. When it was inconvenient. When I was exhausted. When there was nothing in it for them. That's the only definition of family that has ever made sense to me, and I am done apologizing for choosing it. Ren is asleep in the next room. The paint on the guest room walls is still drying. Derek is in the kitchen. The house is quiet in exactly the way I always wanted a house to be quiet, safe and chosen and ours. That's what the choices led to, in the end. Not victory, just peace. And that is more than enough.